Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 17 of Gunnerkrigg Court, The Medium Beginning. This chapter is a tough one because I have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. It has a lot of iconic moments in the story, and some pages that I think are really good, but it also has visually some of the worst pages that I've drawn. So let's just get right to it. Oh, what's this? So we jump right in to see Annie and Kat in a science lesson, and we see outright that Annie is copying the answers from Kat's science work in class, even though she's standing right beside her. I'm happy to say that this came as quite a surprise to a lot of readers when they first saw this page, because they wouldn't have assumed that Annie would do something like copying her friend's work. And we're really starting to see that maybe Annie isn't as perfect as she tries to seem. And interrupting her is Jones, and this is the first chapter where we really get to see Jones and have her speak. And Jones is another character that I've had for a long time. She existed before I started Gunnerkrigg, much like Zimmy and Gamma both did. The concept behind her character has never changed, and I felt again that she would fit perfectly fine into the story of Gunnerkrigg Court. And it goes without saying that I do still want to do other side stories with her, because there's an almost limitless amount of backstory to her that I can draw from. But for now, she is, in the comic, offering Annie the chance to take lessons in mediation, as she calls it, which Annie accepts. I should mention also, just out of interest, that a lot of the backgrounds we'll be seeing in this chapter are directly lifted from the school that I used to attend. The science rooms, for example, are laid out exactly the same way, with the heavy drapes on the windows and the long wooden desks. And in fact, this corner here, room 2F, used to be my form room. It was a science room. And this corridor here that they are walking along joins to a foyer area that my friends and I used to hang out during lunchtimes. Not hugely important, but I'll point out a few things like that as the chapter goes on. But the big event here, which is painfully obvious to me now, this is the page where I went from drawing the comic in pen and pencil on paper and scanning it to working on it all digitally. Drawing the pages on paper in the traditional manner was kind of laborious, but I was slowly getting better at it. And I can show you some examples of the way that the pages were put together. They would start off with a thumbnail, then they'd start off with a very light sketch. Then I would transfer that sketch onto another page very lightly with a light box that I made. And then I would ink it all with fine liners and a brush pen that I was using at the time. This was all done on just normal A4 printer paper. Then I would scan it into Photoshop and adjust the layers so that the black line work would stand out as much as possible, and try to clean things up in general. From there it was a matter of separating the line work out onto its own layer, and then colouring it and working on it in Photoshop as normal. But at this point I knew I was serious enough about the comic that I wanted to maybe get my hands on some equipment that would help me cut down the tedious parts of the process. So I think I was doing commissions at the time, or at least $20 sketches, and after a while I was able to afford a Wacom Cintiq, which is just a big old drawing tablet with a screen, basically. At this point I was using a Wacom Graphire to colour it all, but it was a very small one, and I was never good at drawing on a tablet while looking at the screen. So after a lot of deliberation and stomach aches and worrying and looking at my payslips at the time, I decided to take the plunge and buy the Cintiq. I still worked on the comic in the same way as I did before, but I was able to combine the steps of thumbnailing the pages with directly sketching them and then inking on top of the sketch all at the same time in multiple layers in Photoshop, so that the end result was basically the same thing. However, this page here, I can definitely see where I was not quite used to drawing digitally. And I think if I recall correctly, I sketched this page out normally on paper, scanned it, but then inked it on Photoshop and finished it there. And I can show you some of the ways that this page stands out from the previous ones. If we look here, this is an uncoloured version of an old page drawn traditionally and scanned. You can see that the lines are very rough, even when cleaned up and the levels knocked back. And now if we compare that to this next page where I was trying to find my feet and ink it digitally, we can see that the lines are very smooth and almost free of imperfection, but what that means is the line looks almost mechanical and artificial. A lot of that subtlety is masked by the colouring process, but I can definitely see the difference between these two styles. And the completely clean digital look was not something I was fully happy with, but it was a little while before I came up with a few ideas to find a medium between the two. So to get back to the story, you combine the fact that I was drawing the pages on a new medium now, and I decided that Eglamour would have slightly longer hair now. This resulted in a lot of people being confused as to who this guy was, and it's Eglamour. So there you go. He's there teaching some kids sword fighting, one of the kids being Parley, and I wanted it to be clear that Eglamour and Jones knew each other, and were perhaps quite close. So while they're fighting away, Annie and Jones have a bit of a chat, and this is one of the pages that I enjoyed. Just a big splash page that conveys a lot of text, but in a way that I felt was more interesting than just close-cropped panels of the characters talking to each other. And Jonesy's just explaining what the mediums do and what Annie might be doing. And the lesson ends. So Smitty comes in to join them all because they're meeting up for a lesson. And straight away Parley starts up by patting him on the back and using some innuendo. And then we come to some of the worst pages, I think, in the comic. These are very badly, I think, conveyed. I was going for a certain look in these pages, and they really did not work out. I wanted some of the panels to seem like things were moving very fast and exaggeratedly, but in the end it just made for some very confusing panels that a lot of readers found difficult to follow. And we'll just skip this page entirely. But one thing we do take away is that Jones is not even fazed by a sword glancing off her face. And meanwhile we see that Parley is draping herself all over Smitty again, and outright telling him to try not think about her as she's getting changed. So after a short scene change, we have Jones explaining that some of the children in the court, in particular the 3 here chosen for classes in mediation, have certain abilities that are extra normal in nature, as she calls them. And we see that Smitty is able to take a shuffled deck of cards, throw them up in the air, and then have them all land not only on top of each other, but in perfect order as well. And we hinted that Parley's dad is psychic, and that Parley should have a power, but it hasn't manifested yet. And the Eugene Gould Psychic Challenge that Jones refers to is basically based on the James Randi Foundation, who issued a very similar challenge. Eugene Gould was the name of a cryptozoological explorer that we saw on a bonus page a few chapters back. But we see that despite Parley's dad being a certified psychic, Parley herself hasn't shown her powers yet. We also see that her actual first name is George. So they continue with the lesson, and they walk along. This panel here is based on the pathway behind the library in my old school. And this panel here is the entranceway to my old school. This is the front entrance leading into reception. And this window here is part of the canteen where we used to eat our lunch. But in walking through the school, we come across a familiar corridor, and we see they've come to meet up with Mort. And this sequence of pages are one of my favourite sequences in the comic, where they're just interacting with Mort for the first time. And despite Parley being the way she is, everybody turns out to be quite affable and good-natured and leave the lesson quite friendly with each other. And Jones mentions the fact that by introducing them all together, Annie was able to bring the group of people together with the ghost and get along with each other. At first, Annie thinks that because she already knows Mort, it doesn't quite count, but Jones mentions the fact that because she was able to befriend Mort on her own terms without any help, that was quite a good step in the lessons that she might need in this sort of work. She also reminds Annie, and us the readers, that Coyote has extended an invitation to the forest for her, so she's allowing her to make her own decision when she should go into the forest. And that's basically the end of this chapter, the start of Annie's lessons in mediation. And this bonus page came about because I really couldn't think of anything, so I just drew a bunch of swords. So there you go. Come back again for Chapter 18, S1.